Hi, this is American government. Well into the lecture. And if the groan you just heard was students recognizing how slow and stupid I am. All right.
You're not stupid. You're just not tech savvy. You know what they say PhD means?
What do they say it means?
Phenomenally dumb.
Oh, I thought it meant piled high and deep. All right, well, all right. So, which is, believe me, after having been a PhD and lived my life with PhDs, piled high and deep is, comes much closer to the truth. All right. Um, so, what do parties do in any political system? And here are some suggestions. They, they, one function, critical function, is institutional coordination. Now, we have what that means is this: we have separation of powers. We separate out the legislative branch and the executive branch. In most other constitutional democracies in the world, they are parliamentary systems, which means what? They don't separate the legislative and the executive, they combine them. And even in countries that have monarchies like England and nine of the other countries, or eight of the other countries in Europe still have constitutional monarchies, they're almost all parliamentary systems. What does that mean? People vote for parties, and then the parties meet in the parliament, form a coalition, and try to form a majority government. And out of the majority in the parliament, the executive branch is chosen. In a parliamentary system, the prime minister is literally the head of the executive branch, but he or she is also the majority head of the party in the legislature. But in our system, we separate out the legislature. They are elected differently, and they have different institutional sources. Remember Article 1 and Article 3. Moreover, what do we do to the legislative branch? We divide it. It's bicameral. We also, by the way, divide political power between the national government and 50 states. And within those 50 states, there's also separation of powers and typically a bicameral legislature. So we divide power up among different institutions. It's a natural question. When you divide political power up into so many branches and so many different institutions, how do you coordinate them? And it turns out one of the main functions in our political system is to somewhat overcome the separation of powers by giving a common point of institutional focus within the institution. In other words, the Democrats in Congress, there's both House and Senate, but the Democratic leadership in the House and Senate have cooperated with each other to try to get their bills passed. We have a Democratic president right now who is coordinating with. Now, in the uh, Wilson text, by the way, he raises an interesting question of whether or not those times when we've had different parties in the White House and in the Congress versus those times when we've had different parties, have they been more productive? And it's interesting is they're about equally. So you would think that when it's a different party in the White House, like when you have a Republican president or a Democratic Congress, that fewer things would get done. But actually, there have been some remarkable achievements by presidents and Congresses of different parties. And some members of both parties, when both parties have run both institutions, oftentimes they fail to get important things done. So why would it be that institutional coordination, if you didn't have the same party in both chambers and in the president, because even if you're trying to negotiate with Congress and it's the other party, you still have a focus of interpretation and negotiation. So on one level, the first important function that parties do in our system, especially, is coordinate our institutions. Second, remember, when the rise of the party system, the nomination phase of elections then essentially became the function of political parties. Political parties nominate candidates. They 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 skew candidates. They and you're going to see that one of the big developments in our system is it's getting harder and harder for parties to do that because of primary elections. More about that in a minute. They also fund candidates and pay for elections. Now, the last function is, aside from institutional coordination and nominating and running campaigns and candidates, is popular identification and involvement. One of the important things, why do most people vote according to party even today, even though it's diminished? Because A, If you remember, Sentinel said most people don't pay attention to politics. And I have to say, after teaching American government at college for 40 years, it's not just college students who often don't pay attention to politics. Most people don't. And what party identification does, it's almost a kind of an involvement of people. Now, you may or may not have come from politically active families. I don't know. Were your parents actively and it's self-identified Republicans or Democrats?
No.
Pardon me?
They acted like it, but they didn't really.
Well, did they talk to you about politics? Did your families discuss politics when you were growing
No,
up?
my mom. This was the first time my mom ever voted this past presidential election, and my dad's just dumb. He just watches Facebook videos.
Bless his heart, as they say down here, but not well exactly the way they mean it down here. So on one level, can you see that actually? What are most people doing with their lives if they're not paying attention to politics? Yeah, they're running their families, they're running a business, they're trying to hide from COVID. Do you understand, in other words, why don't most people pay a lot of attention to politics?
They feel like disconnected.
Yeah, I think most Americans actually live in their private lives, and their private lives dominate their public lives. So it's not surprising, in other words, that people need to be drawn into politics, and party identification somewhat does that. More or less, by the way, the other thing is they provide is cues. Not only, and they do this not only for voters in the general electorate. You understand that most members of Congress don't read the bills that they vote on. They're like 1,000 pages, and by the way, where are they drafted? In committees, by and large. And that means if you're on that committee, you know a lot about that bill, but generally speaking, if you're not on that committee, and so what's the major cue that tells members of Congress and voting public how to vote? It's party. So what party does is kind of simplify and add a kind of an intelligible dimension. Look, how many of you live in North Carolina besides me? Now, I've only voted once in North Carolina. In South Carolina, like most of the states, they imitate the federal Constitution. The governor appoints judges. But in North Carolina and about 10 other states, the people actually vote for judges. But they are not allowed, judges running for office are not allowed to put party labels. Now that means this, the one time I voted in North Carolina, and I'm a political scientist, I'm conscientious about this stuff, I left those blank. Why? I had no idea who these people were. And on one level, you could say this. If only you had a D or an R next to their name, you would know one piece of information. And by the way, the party label, as you're going to see, doesn't always predict how people vote. After all, Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat from West Virginia, is voting against his party on the Build Back Better plan. So a party vote isn't like a simple pre-programming unless it's electors in the Electoral College. Nevertheless, what's the most likely predictor if you're a voter and you want to have none of you like to make choices over which you know nothing, right? Flip a coin or something like that. Don't you like to think that when you choose something or make a decision, it's based on something you actually know and that it may have an effect on your choice? Nobody likes to really choose in the dark. And it turns out the only somewhat reliable cue for voters to vote on that actually does kind of have a predictive in terms of the behavior of members in office is party label. And I have to say this, one of the main criticisms we'll deal with when we come to Banfield is that our two parties are so vague, they don't mean anything. I think it would be fair to say, agree or not agree, that if you voted Republican in 2020 for Trump and for the Republican Party, and if you voted Democratic for Biden, the country would look different than it did before today. Do you see what I'm saying? Look, it's not as if voting Republican or Democrat is the same as like voting Nazi or fascist or communist. But isn't it clear that if you had voted for Trump and the Republicans versus Biden and the Democrats, the country would have been steered in a somewhat different direction on many different policies? Your choice might not choose everything in politics, but it does exercise an effect. And as you're going to see, that's one of the things I would defend the two-party system for. It doesn't mean like radical change from election to election. And by the way, would you want that? Would you want to go from communism one election to fascism in the next election with radical changes of policy? To some degree, American policy is like steering an ocean liner. You can't turn on a dime, and you don't want to turn on a dime unless you're in the Titanic. Um, um, in other words, what does it to steer an ocean liner means to go sort of like that or that, right? In some ways, that's what I would argue the two-party system does for American politics. Now, I know you're.
This is stressful.
Why is it stressful?
I don't know.
Stressful?
Yes.
Are any of you other experiencing stress?
Yeah.
What's the stress you're experiencing?
Because it's just. I don't know how to explain this.
All right, well, think about it.
Deeper than I thought it was. I thought we'd just be out here.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I think when we look at the major political changes that our system might undergo in the next 10 years, some kind of change in the party system is the most likely, and or some kind of abolition of the Electoral College. So it's worth thinking about these things because I think they're the most likely to happen, possibly. All right, anyway. So the next major question under B is what have been the major stages? And this material, by the way, is taken both from the Caesar text, the Caesar article, Political Parties and Constitutional Principle, and the Wilson text. And generally speaking, we name the stages in our political party system after the presidents who initiated them or who stood at their beginnings. The original one was nonpartisan. What does nonpartisan mean? Yeah, because remember the framers designed a system where it didn't have parties, where they didn't want parties. And they designed an electoral college that they thought would work without parties, although it only did, again, for the first two elections. And so what were they trying to do in this system is not so much present a partisan direction for the country, but to choose a legitimate and qualified individual. People voted for George Washington because of who George Washington was. But George Washington was probably one of the few presidents that everybody agreed on was a great individual before he became president. And then by the time that political parties formed in 1800, who was elected in 1800? Thomas Jefferson. You could say we had the Jeffersonian. By then, parties had deformed into parties in Congress, and members of Congress voted by parties. And also, the members of Congress tended to nominate the candidate for president. And at the same time, there was also some popular election. The election of Andrew Jackson in 1824 and 1828 probably was the most popular president. That is to say, where more people presented, more people identified themselves by party labels. And by this time, the 1820s and through 1900s, that's when our two-party system really did congeal. There were two parties. There were state conventions that nominated candidates. There was a national nominating convention. And so almost all the major structures of our party system had come into being by the 1820s. Now, the Wilsonian system that started with reform advocated by the progressives, whom you've already heard about in the Schomburg article, but also professor. Well, he was professor. There have been two presidents which have been professors. Woodrow Wilson was one. He was a professor of political science. He got his degree from UVA, my alma mater, and then he was the president of Princeton University, was the governor of New Jersey, and then he became president. So he was the first professor. Anybody know who was the second president? Barack Obama. He was a professor of constitutional law at Harvard University. So we've had two professor presidents.
Wow.
I know. Can I imagine if we had a third one, President Polvorty?
Oh, no, I would not vote for you.
I wouldn't either.
I'm just like...
If you won an A in this course, you have to say you'd vote for me.
I would vote for you, bro.
No.
Matter of fact, I'm going to write you in the next election.
I would... Look, if you would see people fleeing the other side of the border to try to get out of the country if I was elected president. They would be fleeing into Mexico. All right. Now, the major change that the progressives, the Wilsonians, introduced at the turn of the century, and this has become an important structure in our party nominations, is primary elections. What does primary mean?
Primary.
First. Primus means first. So what's a primary election?
The first election.
The first election. And the reason it's called primary is before the primary system of nominating candidates within the parties, the party bosses and organizations would do the nominations. So again, if you were a candidate, Whom would you have to appeal to in order to get your party's nomination?
Party.
Party bosses or organizations, people that were in power a long time. Now, with the rise of party nominations, it's a popular form of nomination, and you're going to see the whole system didn't really change until much later in the 1960s and 70s with what Caesar calls modern reform. And what was the difference? Primary elections try to turn the nominating process over to the people. So the idea is each party now has popular nominating elections. And so if you're a candidate and you want to get your party's nomination, whom do you have to appeal to if it's a primary election?
Your party.
To the people in your party, not the bosses or the organizations, but the people. In other words, you have to run a popular campaign. Now, from 1900 until 1968, only about 6 to 12 states even had primaries, and they weren't even binding. They were just like public opinion polls. But something happened. A dramatic event happened in 1968 that changed the way our parties operate, and that's why you have to call the system modern reform. In the 1968 Democratic Convention, by the way, what was the big issue in 1968 facing the nation?
War.
What war?
Vietnam.
The Vietnam War. And both Kennedy, who had been assassinated, and Johnson, who took it over, had escalated the war. But by 1968, it was becoming unpopular. Yeah. And so major peace candidates arose, but they only arose within the Democratic Party. So in some ways, you had on the Republican side, you had Richard Nixon, who was more or less still pro-war. But on the Democratic side, you had, and the war had become so unpopular that even though Lyndon Baines Johnson's LBJ was eligible to run, and had he run, he might have been elected, but he was so afraid the war had become unpopular that he bowed out of the race. And his vice president, Hubert Humphrey, originally the senator from Minnesota, had become Johnson's vice president, became the establishment Democratic candidate supporting the war. But 3 other candidates, Eugene McCarthy, George McGovern, and Bobby Kennedy, entered the Democratic nomination expressly as anti-war candidates to end the war. One of them got assassinated. Who was it? Who got assassinated?
Wait, can we?
Is this a trick question?
No.
Can we get the options again?
Bobby Kennedy was assassinated in July of 1968. His brother had just been assassinated. President Kennedy had been assassinated, and by the way, Bobby Kennedy was Kennedy's attorney general. And he was a very young man. He was assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan in the lobby of a hotel in Sacramento, I think, and so he was taken out of the race. And so what happened during the Democratic nomination convention in Chicago, which was run by a traditional Democrat, Richard Mayor Daley, the nomination process froze out the anti-war candidates, who then protested. And then Mayor Daley sicked the Chicago police on the protesters. So in 1968, you had the Democratic candidate, the Democratic campaign nomination meeting was a mess. It was terrible to watch on television. And so, as a result, the Democratic Party resolved that they would never have that kind of inter-party war. So they resolved to completely democratize the process of nomination. How? 2 ways. They spread primaries now through every state in the country. So every state in the country now has some kind of primary or popular nominating thing, like a caucus, etc. The other thing is they made the results of primary elections binding on the conventions. So what that means is this. When the Electoral College changed to become popular in party, why do you already know on election night who's going to win the election unless the Electoral College doesn't vote for them? Why do you know that? Why do you know, in other words, on election night who's going to win the presidency, by and large?
Because the people
will vote according to popular vote, right? And the same thing happened with the nominating conventions. Prior to the 1960s, national nominating conventions actually really did nominate the president. They were often exciting. Now they're just campaign rallies because you already know who's won the primaries. Does that make sense? So what happened as a result of those reforms is we now have a purely popular method of not only electing the president on the state level, as you go from the Diamond article, but also nominating. So we have a purely democratic or popular nominating system. Now, is that good or bad? We'll come back to that in a minute. What are the major structures? Where do the parties exist in our country? Remember, even though we have national committees like the Democratic National Committee, and we have national conventions which meet every 4 years to nominate president, most parties exist on the state and local level. Why is that? Because of the operation of the Electoral College. You should understand that argument by now, I assume, correct? So, but then also, so national parties exist primarily in state and local organizations. That's where parties are most active. And so, in other words, we have a Republican Party. And what you really have are 51 local state Republican parties united in a kind of a national coalition. That's the way our parties work. They exist in Congress and the state legislatures, too. They also exist in terms of nominating conventions. How many of you watched the national nominating? Now, by the way, they were kind of suppressed last year because of COVID. They were both virtual.
What are we talking about?
The national conventions. Pardon me. It was, by the way, the Republican was supposed to be in Charlotte, but the COVID restrictions were so intense they moved it to Jacksonville. So, but they were also virtual. They were all like Zoomed too. But normally people watch them. They're sometimes exciting. Did you watch in 2016 when Hillary Clinton got the nomination, all those balloons dropped and everything like that? All right, good. The other place where parties exist, of course, are in people's heads, in families, and in your own identification. Now, where are we today? Let's see. Do you see where this is actually taken from Caesar's article? So, Sophie, if you would read on the bottom of page 1, the creation too stable. So this is essentially the two-party system as we have it. Am I asking you to set your hair on fire?
Yes.
Okay.
The creation of two stable, moderate, popular parties which channels candidate ambition into generating a following among states and local party organizations and leaders which prevents ambitious candidates from crafting a following by employing demagogue.
What's demagoguery? Demagogic. What's the same root? It has a root that you understand.
Demagogue.
Democratic, right?
Yeah.
It comes from the Greek word demos. What's a demagogue? That's a good guess. A demagogue is somebody that gets up and riles the people up into emotion by providing false information or appealing to their emotions rather than to their reason. Have you ever seen recordings of Adolf Hitler speaking?
Yes.
He was probably the greatest demagogue of the 20th century. But there have been other demagogues. In other words, a demagogue gets the people excited about things without really helping them to become more rational or thoughtful, either by misinforming them or simply appealing to their emotions. Are there such people who are capable of that in the world?
Yes.
Are they dangers or are they assets?
Danger.
I think they may be both, but in some ways they could be dangerous because oftentimes they incline people to go against their own best wishes and both needs. So that's what demagoguery is. Oh, go ahead.
Appeals such as image appeals or issue arousals by organizing the electorate into two stable moderate parties. The two-party system prevents destructive division and energies from turning the presidential election to civil war every 4 years.
Now, by the way, can it become still intense and partisan? Yes, it can still happen, but generally speaking, the tendency of the two-party system is to create two moderate alternatives rather than two civil war alternatives. But was there a civil war in this country?
Yes.
So it's still possible that the two-party system, and people would say the 2020 election came very close to being almost an intense partisan contest. Nevertheless, the overall effect of the two-party system is to create moderate alternatives. Go ahead.
The two parties create nominating structures, national conventions that generate two candidates who then compete for the people's popular vote.
Which is essentially the system we have.
I'll read the next.
Sammy.
The progressives and modern
On the next page.
The main modifications to the Van Buren two-party system were the democratizing reforms of the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century through the creation of primary elections, and the spread and dominance of primaries by the modern reformers after the Democratic National Convention in 1968 through the McGovern Commission into the 1970s. The main reform of the latter was to ensure that the candidates for their party's nominations now have to build up popular followings during the primary election stage of the presidential election. since the delegates to the national conventions now come with their votes determined by the primary popular vote. In the same way that the development of parties and the winner-take-all system shifted the election from the Electoral College to the people, modern reform shifted the nomination from the conventions to the people. First, the Democratic Party, then the Republican Party adopted these reforms in the 1970s.
So if you want to become a candidate within one of the two parties, what do you have to do?
Win the primary.
Yeah, that means you have to build up a popular following first. Now, as you're going to see, with a couple of other changes, we'll end here and we'll pick this up. Where are we right now is, and I think you'll all agree with this, as a result, our presidential and congressional and other nomination and election contests are completely popular, democratic, resulting in more demagogic, longer, more expensive, more negative, and more polarized campaigns and parties. Does that seem accurate to you?
I agree.
After all, when does the next presidential campaign typically begin?
Probably the November.
After the end of the one in November. You could say people start running for president. And that means our campaigns have become longer, more negative, more expensive, more televised, because they become more popular. Because if you're a candidate and you have to get a popular following, you have to literally get people excited in you. So you have to go around building up popular followings. As you're going to see, that's kind of where we are right now. All right, we'll finish with Banfield's article on Friday. Wednesday, and we will turn to the presidency and Hamilton on Wednesday.
Can we stop on my room so I can drop off the stuff?